thanks for coming. I was concerned when I saw how many great things are happening in the area tonight.
Yes.
So I'm really thrilled that you have a wonderful group, and really glad that you're all here. This is sponsored by the Dummerston Conservation Commission. We have a real commitment to educating people about what's going on in the natural world. And I read Steve's book in the wintertime, and I thought, people need to know about this. When I walk through the woods now, I'm seeing all kinds of signs of the hurricane of '38. And when I was a kid, I was born after the hurricane, but everybody was talking about it. They talked about it for years and years and years and years. People are probably still talking about it. So, so I thought it was really important that we have Steve come and talk with us. The Dummerston Conservation Commission does lots of educational work. We're doing lots of work about invasives and about the pests that are threatening our forests, and we do lots of just general letting people know what we have around us about the wildlife, and we have begun now sponsoring educational programs for the kids at the school. So anything you can donate to this helps pay for these programs, to pay for good speakers, to pay to have it videotaped so that all of the people who had to make the choice to go to something else tonight can still see this program. So if you can donate. If you can't, that's fine too. We're really glad to have you here. Before we start, John, would you come up and... John is on the Conservation Commission.
Hi. I'm John Anderson, and I head the Putney Mountain Hawk Watch, and we started today counting the hawks for this season. Anyone who's really interested and wants to catch a good day, the middle of September is kind of the peak period, but we're always up there, and anyone who wants to come up and just sit, join in. You don't have to know anything about it. We just love to have people. We'll point out birds and try to identify them. So please come up and enjoy.
And if you need directions, most of you probably know how to get up Putney Mountain. If you need directions, you can go into our website. Our website is dummerstonconservation.com, and you can just send us an email, and we'll do our best to direct you to Putney Mountain. So, Stevie, instead of me trying to introduce you, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and then begin?
Sure.
We're really glad to have you. Really glad.
Thank you. With my partner Ginny Barlow, I was one of the founders of Vermont Woodlands magazine, which became Northern Woodlands magazine in 1999. And so I spent 17 years editing Vermont Woodlands, then Northern Woodlands. And in 2011, I decided to move on and work on something else, at which point I started the research on this book on the '38 hurricane. And so it's been published by Yale University Press a year ago, and it is now out in paperback as of about this week. So I've brought copies with me in case anybody's interested in buying a copy, and so I will get started. So I usually start by asking for a show of hands of people who lived through the 1938 hurricane. All right, that's great. That's great. So when I get things wrong, you just jump right in and correct me. The 38 hurricane was totally unexpected. Nobody had a clue that this was coming. People did not expect that hurricanes happened in New England. Hurricanes were something that happened down south. And so this was the lead story in the Boston Globe the following day. It referred to it as the first hurricane. Now that's just amazing to ponder, since we're so used to at least the remnants of hurricanes. But in 1938, there hadn't been a hurricane in a generation or two, so people were just not thinking about it. And weather forecasting at the time was very, very primitive. So there have only been 3 hurricanes that have come into New England, into central New England, with Category 2 winds. These are the 3. 1635, 1815, and 1938. So just to give you an idea of how unprecedented this was. And so you'll see these tracks are similar and parallel, and the reason they were devastating was because they did not make landfall before they hit New England. And so they hit Long Island and then New England. So they're over the ocean for all that time. When a hurricane makes landfall, then you lose a lot of energy. So this is the track of 38, and you'll see the circles on here are 12-hour intervals, and so you see it coming west from Africa, aimed for Florida, and then headed north. Now, most forecasters thought that it was going to do that. It was going to take that red track. And that's understandable because that's a very, very standard hurricane track. This slide here shows Hurricane Bill in 2011. Very much the same sort of setup. And so you've got this sort of semi-stationary high-pressure system that's out over the Atlantic, and it tends to, it's there all season long, blocking any hurricane. And so hurricanes tend to recurve, just like this. So they go around that high-pressure system. But what nobody knew in 1938 was that Bermuda High, that high-pressure system, was stationed very, very far north. And so there was no way for the hurricane to recurve. And so that's what it did. And so it came forward. And so going back to the intervals, the 12-hour intervals, you see, it's kind of poking along, takes 12 hours to do that. But it turned the corner, and all of a sudden, boom, it just really, really sped up. And so it was 50 miles an hour when it hit New England. So this hurricane, I assume most people here experienced Irene back in 2011. Irene made landfall about a half a dozen times before it got here. We all were watching the weather channels, waiting for it to come. We all knew it was coming. And then Irene came, and it took about a day for it to come and go. That's why there was so much rain, because it stayed over us for that length of time. 38 came and went in 5 hours. So any one place that it hit, it was over in 5 hours. So just very, very fast speed, and that's the only way that it maintained its power all the way this far north, because otherwise it would have dissipated. So this is what it looked like down on the coast. So just like just like Katrina, just like we're worried about Harvey down in the Gulf right now, it hits coastal areas first, and so this 38 was no different. A lot of the damage was due to the storm surge. It's essentially a tidal wave formed by the force of the hurricane. And so 600 people died in the 38 hurricane, 400 people of them in Rhode Island alone. And so whole beachfront communities were just sucked out into the ocean. Ships, boats were deposited inland a quarter mile. And this was just tremendous force down on the coast. So there was tremendous damage from the storm surge. Bless you. And then there was a lot of flooding inland. So this Ware, Massachusetts. Keep your eye on the building there on the right. And so that was taken after the underpinnings of that building were ripped out from under it. So there was flooding everywhere. So you've got the storm surge, the coastal flooding, you've got inland flooding, rivers, and then you've also got the wind. And so so if you think of Irene and all of the water we got, all that rain, all that flooding, you think of Irene and then you add 100-mile-an-hour wind to it, then that's the 38 hurricane. So trees down everywhere. You see these power lines, telephone lines. There was no communication. Nobody knew in advance that it was coming. So when it hit Long Island, you would think, well, wouldn't someone phone ahead or something? It didn't work. All the infrastructure was ripped apart so quickly that no one was able to get the word ahead. So phone lines down and power lines down. You couldn't get anywhere. Trees were across roads everywhere. Trees on houses. So every village, every city, every rural area just had tons and tons of trees down, toppled by the winds. There were also steeples that went down, something 30, 40 steeples. This is in Monson, Massachusetts, the steeple on that church. The Big E, the Eastern States Exposition, that was going on at the time. So the biggest fair in New England was underway the week of the hurricane. Ferris wheels down, all the buildings down. So the damage was estimated at the time to be $300 million, which adjusted to today would be $5 billion. One thing I want to make sure you understand is that homeowners insurance was not common at that time. So it wasn't the insurance companies that coughed up the $300 million. It was a population in New England that was not yet out of the Great Depression. This is 1938. People were struggling. And so you get just one more kick in the teeth to people who are down. So most of what's been written about the 38 hurricane so far has been what happened in southern New England. And rightfully so. That's where most of the damage to infrastructure and the fatalities were largely what happened down there. And that even had a movie star. So here's Katharine Hepburn sitting in the remnants of her house in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. So I was more interested, though, in what happened around here. I wanted to tell the story of what happened in New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts, and what happened particularly to the forests. And so I have, in my book, I have a section on this fella here, Fred Hunt, who was a 14-year-old boy who grew up in Rindge, New Hampshire. And he became a forester, and a forester who was very much involved with white pine. And I'm just going to read a short section from the book about his day playing hooky. So he had heard that the town of Jaffrey had been flooded and it was underwater. And so this was before the hurricane hit. So he was out taking a walk. Fred's next idea of going up over the hill and avoiding all the lowland didn't pan out. At some point he had to drop down, and every place he did was flooded. The water at Route 202 stood higher than the highway fence posts. So he abandoned his quest for Jaffrey and settled on Winchendon in the other direction and just down over the Massachusetts border. He took off down the old Route 202 and made it to the state line. There, he found the highway buckled and a whole section of it with a yellow center line pointing to the top of the maple tree that it was leaning on. The western overflow outlet of Lake Menominee, a 600-acre lake straddling the state line, had been breached. All that water went down into the Millers River, Hunt said. He was impressed. That's when he started back home. His socks were soaked inside his rubber boots, and his heels were blistered raw. By the time he got to Ringe Center, he'd had enough, so he stopped in a store there and telephoned his mother to come pick him up. He calculates that he had hiked somewhere between 15 and 20 miles that day. By the time his mother reached the store late in the afternoon, the rain had returned and the wind was howling. As they drove home, their car was blocked by a small tree across the road. So Fred and his mother stopped at the neighbor's house, which sat up high on the hill, exposed to the wind. They found the 3 women who lived there trying to contain a stream of water pouring through the attic. All the shingles had blown off the roof, and the water was gushing in. Fred's mother stayed there with the neighbors, but she sent him home on foot the remaining half-mile because his father was there alone. Fred said, "I decided that stuff was flying too fast up there on the hill, so I went down across the hayfield and down into the woods and back to the town road at the bottom of the hill." The 14-year-old boy was nearing home, walking down a road that was lined, like so many in New England, by stone walls on both sides. The white pines on either side were 50 to 70 years old, and they stood tall, but not for long. And that's when I happened to look behind me, and there was this pine tree about yay big across the road, about 10 or 15 feet behind me. The diameter was 2 feet anyway, maybe 3. I don't know, I'm looking back now 70-odd years. But it was a good-sized tree, and it just missed me because I wasn't 15 feet beyond it when it came down. I asked him how such a huge tree could fall without him hearing it. He told me to imagine wind blowing so loudly and steadily that you wouldn't notice a 3-ton tree crashing down 5 steps away. With the roar from that wind, you couldn't hear anything else. It was just a roar. In an instant, he realized that the huge tree straddling the road with its top perched on a stone wall could be his refuge from whatever else might happen. So he scrambled underneath it. I was under that pine tree when the hurricane came through, Hunt said. I can picture the situation clearly as he tells the story, and I admire his quick thinking because I'm not sure I would have recognized that fallen tree as a safe haven. He spent 10 minutes, maybe 15, beneath that tree while every other tree in the forest came crashing down. Eventually, he crawled out from under it and poked his head up. There wasn't a single tree standing. My estimate was that 90% of all the trees in Ringe over 6 inches in diameter got blown down in 10 minutes or so. Some of them broke off, but most of them uprooted. Most of it was pine. Try as I might, I couldn't get much more out of him. He had nothing more to say about what it felt like to be under that tree while New Hampshire's worst hurricane blew down every single tree around him. I asked him the obvious question, weren't you scared? People always ask, were you scared? No, I wasn't scared. There was nothing to be scared of. That first tree missed me, then it all came down with a rush and a roar. Another 5 or 10 minutes and there wasn't anything left to blow down. It all went whoosh.
Wow.
The wind continued to roar, but the damage had been done. Once I could see there wasn't much of anything to blow down, why then I crawled my way through it for the rest of the way home. I went home and stayed with my father. One point that Fred took pains to make clear through his story of checking out the flood damage is something that has often been obscured in accounts of the 1938 hurricane. And that is that much of New England was already flooded by an entirely different weather system the day the hurricane hit. Early that day, it showered off and on, but the rain was nothing like it had been the night before. In fact, the water was receding, as he could tell from the high water marks he saw everywhere he went. If the hurricane and all of its wind hadn't arrived later that day, the September weather event would have been known as the flood of 1938. So
What's the actual date that this occurred?
September 21st, 1938.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wow. Was the rain beforehand?
There was 7 inches of rain in the 3 days before. Just
Part of the system, the
N-
same system?
no, just a regular, just rain coming from the west as it so often does. So talk about perfect storms. I mean, we have this tremendous amount of rain, and then boom. So this is what it looked like. That's probably what Fred would have seen, what he would have lived through. Phenomenal blowdown. 600,000 acres flattened, 2.6 billion board feet on the ground. To put the 2.6 billion board feet in context, this truck here has probably about 6,000 board feet on it. So it would have taken 430,000 truckloads
Oh my gosh.
to carry the wood that was on the ground. All that wood went down in 5 hours. What went down in 5 hours was the equivalent of 5 times the annual harvest at that time. So at that time they were harvesting, say, 500 million board feet, 500 million board feet, 5 times that amount on the ground in one afternoon. Convoy of trucks would stretch from Boston and Seattle and back again. So just an outrageous amount.
Those are figures for all of New England?
All of New England, yeah. We know those numbers because foresters spread out into the various states, and they did a tally of the wood. And so here's a forester in front of a root wad that of a tree that blew over. And I wanted to stop for a second. So when we look at a tree that we buy from the nursery, we think of a root ball. You know, we go and it's maybe in a container or maybe bigger, it's a root ball. But when they grow in the forest, they spread out, and the roots spread out, and so it's more like a plate. That's not very deep, it's maybe only that deep, but the roots spread way out, and so that's what people were looking at all across New England. So here's one of the foresters, here's a couple more. You see, in those days, foresters wore fedoras. Not like today, people wear ball caps today, but they wore fedoras. Another one. So these guys are out tallying the amount of wood that's on the ground. So the damage from the hurricane was in, let me see, okay. This map shows town by town damage. And so the highest damage is this color, and you see most of it's Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The only 4 Vermont towns are right up here, Barnet and Reigate and Newbury and Groton, right there. Down here, but you see this string of towns along the river. So these with medium damage, so 1 million to 10 million board feet down. So Dummerston was 1, Brattleboro, Putney, Westminster, Rockingham. All these towns had at least 1 million board feet of damage. So one of the things that I found really, really interesting about it was that the damage was in a real mosaic of a pattern of an acre here, 5 acres there. Very few places where you had as much as 90 acres, although there was one 90-acre blowdown. But a lot of them were, 80% of them were smaller than 5 acres. So I went to explore that, and one of the, I'll go through the 4 different reasons here, but the position of the track and where you lived was the primary one. So you'll see that all of the damage was to the east of the storm. So here's the storm track. and all of the damage is on the east. Now that's because a hurricane is a cyclone. It's a tropical cyclone, and a cyclone has counterclockwise winds. So if this had been a straight line storm going 50 miles an hour, all the wind would have been from the south, and it would have been kind of uniform through the path of it. But because it's a cyclone, you've got this cyclonic wind that is adding to the 50 mile an hour forward motion. So you got 50 miles an hour, the storm moving at 50 miles an hour straight north like that, but then you've got this wind circulating, and then the storm expanding. But so the highest wind is on this side, where the wind of the cyclone coincides with the forward motion, and it adds to it. So on the other side, on the west side of it, it's almost like it cancels it out. So on the east side, you're getting a 50-mile forward motion and a 50-mile-an-hour cyclonic wind. So your wind from the southeast is the highest wind. And so if you happen to be to the west of it, then it was no big deal. I did a talk over in Middlebury. There were old-timers there. They said, oh yeah, it was a flood over there. They didn't have any wind. But here, it was tremendous wind. Another big factor would be the hills, the topography. So if your hill faced south or your hill faced east, then it would be very, very, very vulnerable. If it faced north, the wind, it would have been in the lee, and the storm would have gone right over it. So this is my land in Corinth. Both of these images. The top one, this hill faces east. This one faces south. The hurricane came from basically the vantage point that this photograph was taken from, and so that hill was it was full of large pine trees or large maple trees, and just ready to be blown down. The back side of that hill is this image here. This is the north side of that hill, and there's almost no damage done on that side. Another of the factors was the land use history. So in 1938, Vermont was still farming. So there was probably about 45% forest, maybe 50% forest, and a lot of that forest was young and scrubby. So Vermont didn't have as much of a forest to blow down as Massachusetts and New Hampshire did, where Massachusetts and New Hampshire had more or less stopped farming, say, by 1870. What happens when you stop farming, when you stop grazing cattle and you stop cutting hay, is those fields fill in with trees. And so in 1938, after 6 or 7 decades of not growing cows but growing trees, you had more pine growing in New Hampshire and Massachusetts than you ever had. So there was all of that pine ready to blow down because of the land use history. And pine, because it grows fast and tall, is the most vulnerable of the species. And so you see on the left here these pines growing big and tall. They're just very, very vulnerable to the high winds of a hurricane. In a hardwood forest, the trees would have had to have been much more mature. See, these pines could have blown down at 30 years of age. A 30-year-old hardwood would just go back and forth in the wind. It wouldn't have a trunk that was so stiff that it would act as a lever. If you get to be a larger tree, a 10 or 12-inch diameter tree, you really have a good lever. And so it can get knocked down. So all of this brush on the ground, people were very, very concerned that another disaster was going to follow the first one. And particularly in Massachusetts, they were very worried about the possibility of fire. And so this being the 30s, the New Deal, there was labor force ready at hand. There was both CCC camps, Civilian Conservation Corps camps, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. These were make work programs that were putting people to work in the Depression. So they were ready to jump in and clean the brush. So the Forest Service came in and administered this program, overseeing the various labor to clean up the tops. And so they fanned out, and they're using axes and small saws, and that's because the chainsaw did not exist yet. The chainsaw wouldn't exist for 10 more years. So all of that was cleaned up with those saws and axes. Here's a WPA crew in Keene, New Hampshire. And so basically what they did is they piled the brush in piles, and then when it was raining or if there was snow cover, they would torch it. And so they torched thousands and thousands of brush piles in an attempt to get rid of all of this brush in a safe manner. So over the course of really only about 6 or 8 months, because they tried to do this before summer of the next year, this is what the WPA and the 5,500 CCC boys did. Cleared over 10,000 miles of trails. Fire towers. So at the time, fire towers were really a big part of the fire protection effort. There's 300 some fire towers in place, and all of that, the roads to those, the trails to the fire towers, plus the telephone cables to those fire, they were all down. And so in order to get those back online as a useful tool, they needed to reconnect telephone lines. And so they reconnected 563 miles of telephone lines. Almost 5 million man-days spent in this first 6-8 months to clear brush. It's a phenomenal use of labor. So on the other side, so you've got all of that brush, but then you've also got these logs. And so you've got, as I said, there's 5 times the annual harvest is on the ground. Given that, what sawmill is gonna pay for logs? I mean, they're basically everywhere and they're free, right? I mean, people would pay to have them cleared up. So the government came in and set up the Northeast Timber Salvage Administration, and it agreed to buy logs. So if you could deliver the logs to a concentration yard or to a pond, they would buy them from you. And so they did. And the government was so speedy that the first checks were paid out within a month of the blowdown. So in October 21st, a check was cut to a landowner for logs. They stored them in ponds because they thought that they were going to be holding on to this wood for 5 or 10 years. And pine, if you leave it out in the field, it's going to it'll get stained from fungus. It'll get a blue stain. It'll also get invaded by pine sawyer beetle. And so in order to keep the pine viable, they put it in ponds. In those days, there were permanent sawmills, but it was more that instead of bringing wood to the sawmill, you brought the sawmill to the wood. So these are portable mills. This is a portable mill. It would take 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, to set it up. It's not like a wood miser today that you can just pull behind your pickup truck and set it up in a couple hours. But you would bring it in, you'd bring it to the wood. So this was one set up at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. Here's another one that was in New Hampshire. So you see, it's a good-sized mill, but it's temporary. That these things, they would bring them in, and they would have them there until they ran out of wood, and then they would move it to another place. So you would have to know that there was enough wood in any place in order to go ahead and move your mill. So here's the loggers at work, as opposed to, you know, cleaning just the tops. Here's guys cutting logs. And then we had, so here's the technology, the highest technology of the day, a crawler tractor with a scoot behind it. And so you've got the logs loaded on that. And you got a bunch of guys there with PVs. This is a pond, frozen in winter. And so if there's any silver lining to the hurricane of 38, is that it put people back to work. Anybody who wanted to work could find a job, either logging or at a sawmill or any of the various things that had to be rebuilt. I mean, there was so much had to be done.
I was just wondering, who were the people who were hiring them? Were these the landowners?
No, it was sawmill operators would hire them. The fellows who owned those portable mills, but yes, in fact, yes. So a landowner would contract with a logger, and the logger would go in and do that and skid the logs for them and truck them. Yeah. So here's one of the largest of the. There's 5 million board feet in that pond. That's Harvard Pond down in Petersham. And a lot of those, not a lot, something like 2% of the logs ended up on the bottom of the ponds. And people continue to this day to pick out logs from the 38 hurricane. And you can tell it's from the 38 hurricane because there's a stamp at the end of them that says U.S.
So they don't rot in the water?
No. If they're not in contact with both oxygen and water, they do fine. If it's just underwater, they'll come out and you could put them on a mill and make beautiful lumber out of it. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what you might see in your woods today if you had hurricane damage in 1938. So, yeah.
So what happened to all that wood?
Well, so the wood, about a little more than half of that 2.6 billion board feet was salvaged. So say there's 1.3 billion board feet. And this was 1938, and they're sawing into 1939, 1940. So what's about to happen is World War II. And so World War II, even before we got into it, we were shipping a lot of material over to Europe. And so a huge percentage of that wood was used for crating and pallets and any kind of packing to pack up material for the war effort. And then once we were in the war, the same sort of thing. It was quite useful for that. So in the woods today, almost 80 years later, there are signs that you can see that will tell you whether your woods blew down in 1938. So I'm standing on my land in a pit right there, looking at a mound. So this combination of pit and mound topography is characteristic of any place where a tree goes over. So that's not by itself an indicator of the hurricane. Here's what happens when a tree goes down. You see that where the tree was standing, it's all the roots pull the soil out with it, and so you get this pit right there, and then right next to it is all of this soil in this root plate is standing upright. Over time, that will disintegrate, the wood will rot, the soil will fall into place, and you'll have this combination of a pit and a mound. So if you stand in the pit and look out over the mound, you can tell what direction the tree fell, because the wind was at your back and it tipped the tree over that way. So if on your land you see a steady accumulation of pit and mound topography all facing to the north and the northwest, then chances are that was from a southeast wind, the only southeast wind in many generations strong enough to blow down trees was the 1938 hurricane. So, one pit and mound is not going to tell you much, but if you see a lot of it, and my woods are full of them this size. I mean, really, you could put a little Volkswagen in there. I mean, it's just really, this is not something you wouldn't notice. It's big and dramatic. Another thing is that trees that were tipped by the wind, they right themselves because they're looking for sunlight. And so if a tree gets tipped and it's 45 degrees, it's going to then reach for the light. And trees do it in different ways. Softwoods just sort of put that curve on it and recurve back to going vertical, whereas a hardwood tree like this one, this is a hop hornbeam, a hardwood tree like this will have that characteristic boomerang shape that happens in this way. So here's a little ash tree that whose top has been pinned to the ground by this big tree, this tree that died and fell on top of it. And so you see the top is down here, and all of these side branches are now fighting to become the new leader on that tree. One of those will become the new main stem on that tree, but you see that you get the former shape and then that, and it's that boomerang shape. Here's a few more at different stages of how that happens. Again, seeing some of this in your woods, and they would be larger than this because these are quite recent. But if you see a bunch of that and those trees are tipped to the north or northwest, again, probably hurricane of 38. So these are definitely from the 38 hurricane on my land. This one on the right was basically just sort of hugging the hill, and then it finally took off up again. And then my favorite one, that's just such a big tree, and then you got that one, and then these various other. So go out and take a look and see what you see. So in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, where so much of what went down was white pine, what happened basically was that it was a reduction in the amount of white pine in that forest. And that white pine was there as a temporary placeholder. It wasn't the natural forest for much of that land. The natural forest was a mix of hardwoods and softwoods. So what happened was that pine basically, it didn't disappear, but it became a much smaller percentage of the forest, so that pine forest up here became this as it regrew, which is more what was in place when the settlers arrived. In Vermont, it was different because, again, because of the agricultural history, and much of what blew down in Vermont was ridgetop sugar bushes, woodlots, hardwood woodlots, and so in Vermont there was a lot of hardwood that went down, and so these are two shots from the same vantage point, one in 1940 and one just recently, and so these fellas here are showing off the new town plow, and I just happened to find this photo at the town hall. But what interested me was not the plow, but this hillside. And so you see this hillside, this is a hillside that was blown down by the 38 hurricane. You see, it wasn't totally, just just everything on the ground. It's more like just like a bad haircut, kind of. And so you've got that, but look how much open land there is compared to this. And so what happened was this farmer, by losing his sugar bush up there, which gave him enough money to pay a hired man for a year. This is not just pin money, this is real money that they lost in losing their sugar bush. A lot of people went out of farming following the 38 hurricane. And so all of that farm abandonment, all of those fields that had been abandoned in Massachusetts and New Hampshire 70 years prior, this was when it really, really took off in Vermont following the 38 hurricane. So basically what happens in a hurricane is the upper canopy, the tall trees blow down, and then whatever is underneath them will survive. And if they don't get totally trampled by logging equipment or the falling trees. And so this underbrush, these trees under here, will become the new forest. And so that's what happened all over Vermont when the hurricane came through. This is a tree cookie, a slice of a tree that I cut a few years ago on my land. And you can see the growth rings here being very, very narrow up until right here, which is 1938, and then being quite wide all the way out to here. So you see that, and then on the graph shows the same thing. So this tree was I could read the rings back from the edge there to 1892. So this is an 1892 tree. So at 50 years old in 1938, that tree was 2 inches in diameter. That's all, 50 years old. The sugar maple can do that. Sugar maple can stay in under the canopy and just bide its time. It's shade tolerant. But so then what happened is that forest blew down over it and it just took off. And so from 2 inches, it went to 14 inches in that period of time. And so that was happening to trees everywhere. And that's basically how I could buy a piece of woods in 1988 and be told that those woods blew down in the 1938 hurricane, and how I would have been amazed at that, and because there's a lot of trees of this size, and so my interest in this hurricane came from that after 50 years it had recovered to that extent. And so now we're 80 years on, and so we've got a forest that has just really, really grown big. But with that comes increased vulnerability, because as I was describing, tall trees are vulnerable to hurricane winds. And so when the next hurricane comes, it might be this year, it might be 10 years, it might be 500 years. We have no way of knowing, so there's no way of planning for it. But when it comes, it's going to come to a forest that is full of much larger trees and many more larger trees. The other thing that's going to happen is it's coming to an area that has almost twice as many people living in it as there were in 1938. So in 2010, there's 17 million people in the footprint of the hurricane as opposed to the 9. So when people start, when the insurance companies start doing a risk analysis of of a hurricane now, they estimate that a replay of the 1938 hurricane would be a $40 billion event. So not the $5 billion that would have been just the bringing the dollar up to today's dollar amounts. So much more infrastructure, so many more people, just so much more possibility for damage. So that's what I have for you, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Yeah, could you contrast the kind of damage that exists from a hurricane with the damage that we saw in, I think it was 1995, particularly in the Adirondacks, from the derecho that came through, that took down huge swaths of the Adirondacks?
Right. So that's a straight line storm, and so that would have all the trees would have been in, like a hurricane, would have been probably in the same direction. But like a tornado, a derecho is just a weather event. It's not a weather system. So it's the main difference is in the scale. So the hurricane affected a 90-mile wide swath, whereas that derecho, I'm not sure how wide it was. I mean, it hit, and then it went miles before it hit again. And so, I mean, it's essentially a line of thunderstorms that come in. And so the damage in places would have been exactly the same, but on a smaller scale. Yeah.
Do you have any data on the number of bridges that were taken out?
It wasn't really my main focus, so I don't. But yeah, I mean, besides highway bridges, there were also railroad trestles, railroad bridges. There was, New England was at a standstill. I mean, it was just, and dams were breached, and just many bridges down, highways. We build highways along rivers, and just so many of them, like with Irene, were undermined by the flooding.
So that tropical storm that hit before the rainfall that hit right before the day before, did that loosen up the roots and make it easier for the trees to grow down?
That's a great question, and it was an assumption that I had going in, that okay, so all of this rain. It wasn't a tropical storm that before. I mean, it was just your basic garden variety bunch of rain coming from the west. But so I asked ecologists about this, and their response was, yeah, I mean, that intuitively sounds right, but in fact it wasn't, because if you look at all the photos of the trees that were down, all the roots snapped off. So they tried to hold their ground, and then they snapped off. So they were holding just fine. It's just that the wind finally knocked them over. And so if it wasn't the case, it would have been a lot of mudslides. Trees would have just slipped out of the soil. But yeah, so I went in with that assumption.
So it
and
had
then,
nothing to do with it.
no, not the amount of damage. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Your original question was who lived through the hurricane, and I raised my hand.
Yeah.
If you had said who remembered the hurricane, I would have kept my hand down, because I was 2 years and 3.5 weeks old at the time.
Yeah.
However, one of my earliest memories as a little child was the cleanup.
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm over here in Winchester, which had about 100 acres of woodland, and east and southeast facing slope behind the house. My sister, who was is still 7 years older than I am, remembers looking out her bedroom window and seeing all those trees bend way over it must have been a lot of hardwood at the time, but there was a lot of windfall as well.
Yeah.
And what I recall was Canadian woodsmen that were brought in,
Oh,
and
yeah,
some of them boarded in our home.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and extra pairs of horses that were stabled in our barn were there for skidding the logs out of the woods.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you had any information about those Canadian woodsmen that made it all the way to southern New Hampshire, who hired them, etc.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. The so the industry at the time, it was really in the tank. I mean, there just wasn't much. The mills had been mothballed. There was not much work going on, and so when you need this amount of labor, skilled labor, sawmills and loggers came in from all over. So they came in from as far away as Wisconsin, West Virginia. I hadn't heard Canada, but it makes great sense. I mean, that's close by, and so the areas that had a real, still vibrant timber industry, northern New Hampshire and that part of Maine that got hit, they were able to handle it on their own. But the other places, yeah, people came in from all over because there was work. And I've met various people who are here now because their family moved here to work on those mills, and they just settled here. So there was a lot of that. Thanks for that. That's great.
Yeah, you said that half of the wood was salvaged. What happened to the other half and why?
Well, half of it was salvageable, as in it was in the topography or the place it was in. You could get a logging crew too. If you couldn't, it sat in the woods and rotted. Now, Pisgah State Park over, I believe it's actually in Winchester, isn't it?
Most of it is in Winchester.
Yeah. So there's an in-holding in Pisgah. Pisgah blew down in 38. There's an in-holding in there, about a 20-acre piece that's owned by Harvard Forest. And they decided not to salvage that. And so this was an old-growth forest in 1938. Big honking trees. And most of those went down. And a lot of those you can still see in there. They're all horizontal, but where they spanned and didn't touch the ground. If they touched the ground, they're rotting away. But if they didn't touch the ground, if only the top did, you could walk on those. I mean, they're just as sound today as they were. So pine rots very, very slowly, and hardwood, on the other hand, will be gone definitely within 50 years. Yeah, it's counterintuitive, but yeah.
Could you say something more about why the great predominance of pine over against other softwoods or?
Yeah, well, pine is pine colonizes old fields very, very effectively. You'll get aspen, you'll get paper birch, but pine really seems to it gets a good start, and once it'll take 3 or 4 or 5 years to really develop, but once it develops, it just grows so fast that it took over. And so you'll see these places. I mean, you look at any farm field now that's going out, and you'll see pine in it. Even if you don't see a pine on the edge of the field. I was in a hardwood forest the other day. I could not find the seed source for the pine that was in this little clearing. It's remarkable how it gets in there. It's very good at seeding. Once it's seeded in, it really takes over.
And you said that about 45% of the land was open at that time that had been regenerating with one?
in Vermont, I think it was about, these numbers are really hard to come by, but I think it was about 45% forested at that time, more. And it was, and a lot of that could have been kind of scrubby. So maybe figure 40% mature forest in Vermont at the time, as opposed to 70 or 75% in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Yeah. So just so much more volume ready to blow down.
Weren't a lot of those trees weevilled? I mean,
Oh yeah.
so they were all, yeah.
Yeah, terrible. So Lynn asked about weren't they weevilled? So there's white pine weevil. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I just had a brain
Yeah,
cramp
yeah.
there. But what happens is that the leader of a pine, the top of the stem, will get eaten by the weevil, and then another one of the branches will take over, and so you'll end up having pine that is really crooked. It just will develop many stems. If it grows totally in the open, it'll be what's called cabbage pine, and just really wide, not growing straight and tall like you want a timber tree. I'm gonna just see if I can find. Lots of times I have these extra slides. So, okay, I don't have it. That's too bad. So I have a photo of. I have a photo of a lumber yard filled with lumber that was cut, and you should see some of this stuff. I mean, this is not what you would consider a good board. These are crooked. They're skinny. They're just not what we would look at as lumber. And the reason for that is that back then most pine was used for boxboard, and so this was in the 1930s. This is before plastic. It's before cardboard. Things were shipped in pine boxes. Pine is very light, and so the fact that these trees were weevilled didn't matter because they could use every inch of the tree. It didn't. They would just slice it right through, and you'd have a limb, a side limb like this, and they would just slice it through. And yeah, because a box, that long, and you make it out of boards that wide. I mean, you could use so much of a pine tree. And so the Forest Service, they came in and they wanted New England to get out of this habit of growing crappy trees for boxboard. They wanted them to start growing beautiful straight trees. And so they graded the lumber, and they wanted all of they wouldn't buy lumber that was round edged, which is, you just sort of you slice it through and the bark is showing on either side of the board. They wanted their lumber four edges squared up, and so they did this because they really wanted to cure New Englanders of this notion of using lumber like this. And so they didn't want people using lumber for boxes. They wanted it to be, floors and furniture and higher uses. But when you asked me the question, what did the lumber go to? I was thinking, so do I go back and I tell them all about this boxboard? And so the great irony of ironies is that after all of that, they got this beautiful lumber, and what did they use it for? Boxes to crate stuff in. So, yeah.
I have an interesting book called New England Hurricane, no doubt you know it.
Is that the one
It's
put out by the WPA?
Yeah, it was put out
Okay.
like a month afterwards.
Isn't that
It
amazing?
is amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
But it also talks about the apple orchards.
Yeah.
In Vermont, all over the state, century-old trees barricaded highways. Apple orchards and maple sugar groves were torn to ruins.
Yeah.
The apple crop, a total loss, and half the sugar trees irreparably injured.
Yeah.
Yet in comparison with the rest of New England, Vermont was fortunate with only 7 deaths attributed to the storm.
Right.
And then I've got some pictures here, people could look at it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book. Put
But
out.
then it talks about people taking advantage of the crop and you know, they, restaurants serving their customers cider instead of water, apple dishes being featured, housewives buying apples for the health of their families.
Oh, that's great.
You know,
That's great.
it's,
Yeah, that's a wonderful book. Amazingly, so the WPA got that book out in a month, and it's just phenomenal. Yeah, yeah. The WPA took a bad rap on a lot of cases. You know, it was sort of out of the, compare the WPA to the CCC. The CCC are these young bucks off at a camp. It's like a paramilitary organization where they're just really, really well trained and ready to go. And the WPA is administered by the counties. Any family who needed relief could send one person to, and they would go. And basically, it was known as a bunch of guys leaning on shovels, you know, and not. But in fact, as you saw on my slide, there a tremendous amount of work got done by the WPA guys. Anybody else? Oh, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.